I hadn't meant to find it. The path, I mean. I was just walking, trying to clear my head after a long week, when I noticed a gap in the hedgerow I'd never seen before. Strange, considering I'd walked this road dozens of times over the years. The opening was barely visible, hidden behind overgrown blackberry bushes. Through it, I could make out what looked like an old path, the kind that gets forgotten when people stop using it. Something about it pulled at me. Curiosity mixed with a feeling I couldn't quite name, like I was supposed to find it. I pushed through the gap, branches catching on my shirt. The temperature dropped immediately in the shade, and the air smelled different here. Earth and wild herbs, untouched by traffic or people. The path ahead was clear enough to follow, winding upward through thick hedgerows of hawthorn and elder. As I walked, I found myself wondering who had made this path and where it led. The hedgerows were old, decades old at least, and the path had that worn quality that only comes from years of use. But there were no footprints in the dirt, except my own. How long had it been since anyone came this way? The climb was gentle but steady, and after about 10 minutes, the hedgerows opened up. What I saw made me stop completely. A meadow stretched out in front of me, maybe 2 acres across, filled with wildflowers I hadn't seen since I was a kid. Poppies, cornflowers, daisies, the kind of wild meadow that barely exists anymore. I stepped into it, the grass coming up to my knees. The afternoon sun was warm but not harsh, and I could hear bees working the flowers, their hum constant and purposeful. In the distance, I caught the faint sound of running water, a stream, maybe. As I walked deeper into the meadow, I tried to place where I was. I knew this area, or thought I did, but I couldn't remember ever seeing this field on any map or hearing anyone mention it. It was like stumbling onto a place that existed outside the normal geography of things. My mind went back to childhood, to summer days spent outdoors without any real destination. My grandfather used to take me on walks through fields like this, teaching me the names of wildflowers and which bird songs belonged to which birds. He'd been gone for 15 years now, but standing here, I could almost hear his voice pointing out the difference between a meadow peepit and a skylark. The memory didn't make me sad. It made me feel grounded, connected to something I'd lost track of in the busy years that followed. When had I stopped taking walks just to walk? When had I stopped noticing things like wildflowers and bird songs? I found myself moving toward the center of the meadow, where the grass grew shorter. There was a spot there, cushioned with moss that looked like it had been made for resting. I sat down, then lay back, staring up at the sky. The sky was perfectly clear, just one small cloud drifting across it. I watched it change shape slowly, the way I used to as a kid, seeing animals and faces in its edges. My breathing had slowed without me noticing, falling into rhythm with the grass moving through the breeze. I'm not sure how long I lay there, long enough for the sun to shift, for the shadows to grow a bit longer, long enough to feel genuinely rested for the first time in weeks. The constant mental chatter I usually carried with me had quieted, replaced by the simple awareness of being in this place at this moment. When I finally sat up, the light had turned golden, that particular shade that means late afternoon is sliding into evening. I looked around the meadow again, trying to memorize it. Something told me I'd be coming back here, that this wasn't just a random discovery, but the beginning of something. The path continued on the far side of the meadow, disappearing into a line of oak trees. I could follow it now or come back another day. Either way, I knew I'd found something valuable. Not just a forgotten path, but a doorway back to a part of myself I thought was lost. I stood up slowly, brushing bits of grass from my clothes. The bees continued their work around me, indifferent to my presence. The breeze kept moving through the wildflowers. Everything here existed independent of me, had existed long before I found it, and would continue long after I left. There was something comforting in that thought. I walked back toward the gap in the hedgerow, but stopped halfway and turned around one more time. The meadow looked different from this angle, wilder, more mysterious. Beyond it, the oak trees stood dark against the brightening sky, and I wondered what lay in that direction. What other forgotten places might be waiting to be rediscovered? Tomorrow, I decided. Tomorrow I'd come back and see where the path led. For today, this was enough. This unexpected gift of a meadow. This reminder that there were still quiet places in the world where time moved differently, where you could breathe without the weight of everything else pressing down. I pushed back through the gap in the hedgerow and stepped onto the familiar road. The sound of a car in the distance reminded me of the world I'd left behind. Just for an hour, but it felt like longer. I started walking home, already planning when I could return. I came back the next morning, earlier than I'd planned. Sleep had been difficult, not in a bad way, but restless with anticipation. I kept thinking about the meadow, about the path continuing into those oak trees, about what might be waiting there. By 6 o'clock, I'd given up on staying in bed and was already dressed and heading out the door. The gap in the hedgerow was easier to find this time, like my eyes knew exactly where to look. I pushed through and started up the familiar path, my legs remembering the gentle climb. The morning air was cool and damp with dew, and everything smelled green and alive. Birds were everywhere, their dawn chorus in full swing, and I found myself walking faster, eager to reach the meadow. When I emerged from the hedgerows, the meadow looked completely different in the early light. The wildflowers were still closed, waiting for the sun to warm them open. The grass was heavy with moisture, and spiderwebs stretched between the stems, intricate and perfect, each one holding hundreds of tiny water droplets. I'd never seen anything quite like it. I didn't stop this time, just moved through the meadow toward the oak trees on the far side. The path was clearer now that I knew what I was looking for. A faint track through the grass, slightly more worn than the surrounding vegetation. Someone had definitely walked this way before, many times, though probably not recently. As I approached the tree line, I noticed something I'd missed yesterday. There was a wooden post at the edge of the meadow, weathered and gray with age, leaning slightly to one side. I stopped to examine it and found faint carved letters, almost illegible from decades of rain and sun. I traced them with my finger. Ashford Estate, 1952. An estate. That explained the meadow, the maintained path, the deliberate planting of the hedgerows. This had been part of someone's property once, carefully tended and loved. I wondered what had happened to it, why it had been left to grow wild. The path led me between two massive oak trees, their trunks so wide I couldn't have wrapped my arms around them. They formed a natural gateway, and passing through them felt significant, like crossing into a different world. The light changed immediately, filtered now through layers of leaves, turning everything into shades of green and gold. The forest floor was carpeted with last year's fallen leaves, soft and silent under my feet. The oaks gave way to other trees, ash and beech, their smooth gray bark bright against the darker trunks. Ferns grew in thick clusters wherever enough light reached the ground, and I could hear that water sound again, louder now, somewhere ahead and to my left. I followed the sound, leaving the path for the first time. The ground sloped downward gently, and after about 50 yards, I found it. A stream, maybe 6 feet across, running clear and fast over smooth stones. The water was so transparent I could see every pebble on the bottom, every small fish darting between them. I knelt beside it and put my hand in. The cold was shocking, the kind of cold that could only come from underground springs. I cupped some water and drank it, remembering my grandfather doing the same thing on our walks, teaching me how to find clean water by the plants that grew beside it. Watercress and brooklime lined the banks, both signs of good, drinkable water. The stream seemed to run parallel to the path, so I decided to follow it instead. It felt more alive than the path somehow, more purposeful. Water always knows where it's going, always finds the easiest way down. I picked my way along the bank, stepping over roots and ducking under low branches. After about 10 minutes, the stream widened into a small pool, dark and still. The trees opened up here, letting in more light, and I could see the pool was deeper than I'd expected, maybe 8 or 10 feet at its center. The water was so clear it looked black, and I could see fish suspended in it, completely motionless, like they were frozen in time. On the far side of the pool, I noticed something odd: stone steps leading down to the water's edge. They were old, covered in moss and partially crumbled, but definitely man-made. Someone had built this, had used this pool for something. Bathing, maybe, or just a place to sit and cool off on hot summer days. I walked around the pool to get a closer look. The steps led up from the water to a flat area that had once been paved with stone, though most of it was hidden now under moss and leaf litter. Behind it, barely visible through the undergrowth, I could make out the remains of a stone wall, waist-high and crumbling. My heart beat faster. This wasn't just an old estate. There had been a building here. A house, probably, or maybe a garden house. I pushed through the ferns and brambles, following the line of the wall. It curved around, forming the outline of what must have been a small structure, maybe 20 feet across. The walls were still standing in places, reaching as high as my shoulders, but there was no roof anymore, just open sky. Inside the ruins, nature had taken over completely. Young trees grew up through what must have been the floor, their roots breaking apart whatever foundation had been laid. But I could still see traces of human habitation. A stone fireplace in one corner, its hearth filled with fallen leaves. A rusty iron hook still embedded in the wall above it. The remains of what might have been a window frame. I stood in the center of the ruin and slowly turned, trying to imagine what it looked like when it was whole. Someone lived here, or at least spent time here. They sat by that fireplace, looked out those windows, walked down those steps to the pool. Maybe they'd done it for years, decades even. And then, for whatever reason, they left and never came back. The thought made me inexplicably sad. Not the heavy, dragging sadness of loss, but something gentler, a melancholy for the passage of time, for the way everything eventually returns to the earth. Even the stones themselves were slowly crumbling, would eventually be nothing but dust. I found a section of wall that was still solid and sat down on it, looking out over the pool. The sun had risen higher now, and light was filtering through the trees in visible shafts, bright and golden. The fish in the pool had started moving, breaking the surface occasionally to feed on insects. I could hear a woodpecker somewhere deeper in the forest, its rhythmic hammering echoing through the trees. Who had lived here? The date on that post had said 1952, 73 years ago. Had the house been abandoned even then, or was that when it was still occupied? I wished I could somehow reach back through time and ask them questions. What brought you here? What made you leave? Were you happy in this quiet place? I sat there for a long time, thinking about permanence and impermanence, about the way places outlast the people who make them. Eventually, I stood up and continued exploring. Behind the ruin, the land rose steeply, and I could see the path continuing upward through the trees. It looked like it led to the top of the hill. I glanced back at the pool one more time, committing it to memory. The dark water, the stone steps, the ruins slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Then I started climbing, following the path as it switched back up the hillside. My legs burned with the effort, but it was a good burn, the kind that came from using your body the way it was meant to be used. The trees thinned as I climbed higher, and I could see glimpses of sky through the branches. Almost there, just a bit further. The path leveled out suddenly, and I found myself at the top of the hill, standing in a small clearing. And the view, I wasn't prepared for the view. I could see for miles in every direction. The meadow below, looking like a green and gold jewel surrounded by forest. Beyond it, patchwork fields stretching into the distance. A village I didn't recognize nestled in a valley to the north, and in the far distance, almost hidden in haze, what looked like mountains. I stood there catching my breath, feeling like I'd discovered something important. Not just a forgotten place, but a whole forgotten world existing parallel to the one I knew, waiting to be found by someone willing to look. The sun was warm on my face now, and I realized I'd been gone for hours. But I wasn't ready to leave yet. There was still more to explore, more to discover. Tomorrow, I decided. Tomorrow I'd come back earlier, bring water and food, maybe spend the whole day here. For now, I sat down in the clearing and simply looked out over the landscape, feeling more connected to the world than I had in years.
I kept my promise to myself and returned the next day with a backpack, water, some bread and cheese, an apple. I felt slightly ridiculous, like a kid preparing for an adventure, but also excited in a way I hadn't felt in years. There was something about not knowing what I'd find that made everything feel more alive. This time I went straight through the meadow without stopping, past the oak gateway and down to the stream. I paused at the pool and the ruins just long enough to confirm they were real, that I hadn't imagined them. Then I continued up the path toward the hilltop clearing. But when I reached the clearing, I noticed something I'd missed in my distracted state yesterday. The path didn't end at the summit. It continued on the far side, descending the opposite slope. I could see it winding down through the trees, fainter than before, but definitely still there. Of course, the path had to lead somewhere. No one builds a path to nowhere. I started down, moving more carefully now. This side of the hill was steeper, and the path was more overgrown. Brambles reached across it in places, and I had to push them aside to get through. The trees were different here too, more evergreens mixed in with the deciduous forest, making the woods darker, more enclosed. The descent took longer than the climb, and my knees were complaining by the time the path finally leveled out. I found myself in a narrow valley, densely wooded on both sides. The path ran straight through it, more purposeful here, as if it had been more frequently used in this section. I walked for maybe 20 minutes, the valley gradually widening around me. The trees began to change again. I started seeing fruit trees mixed in with the wild ones. An old apple tree, gnarled and twisted, but still alive, covered in small green fruits. A pear tree leaning at a dramatic angle, half its roots exposed. A cherry tree that must have been magnificent once, now mostly dead, but with a few living branches still putting out leaves. Fruit trees meant cultivation. Someone had planted these, tended them. I felt my pulse quicken. Was I getting close to something? The path curved around a large oak, and suddenly I was standing at the edge of what could only be described as a garden, or what had once been a garden. It was massive, at least an acre, maybe more, enclosed by a stone wall that was still mostly intact. The wall was about 6 feet high, built from the same gray stone as the ruins by the pool. I found the entrance, an arched gateway with the remains of an iron gate hanging from one hinge, rusted nearly through. I pushed it gently, and it opened with a groan. the sound startling a blackbird that had been perched nearby. It flew off with an indignant cry. Inside was chaos and beauty mixed together. What had once been organized garden beds were now wild tangles of growth, but I could still see the underlying structure, straight paths laid with stone, now mostly hidden under moss and weeds. Raised beds outlined in brick, some still holding what might have been herbs or vegetables, now long gone wild. But what was extraordinary was that some of the original plants had survived. Not just survived, thrived. There were roses everywhere, massive bushes of them, grown into twisted, thorny giants. Some were blooming even now, heavy with flowers in shades of pink and deep red. Their perfume hung thick in the air, almost overwhelming. I walked deeper into the garden, following one of the overgrown paths. On my right, I passed what must have been the vegetable section. Tomatoes had gone wild here, seeding themselves year after year, until there was a whole thicket of them. Cherry tomatoes mostly, some still green, some red and splitting with overripeness. I picked one and ate it. The taste exploded in my mouth, more intense than any tomato I'd bought from a store, sweet and acidic at once.
Further in, I found fruit bushes, raspberries and black currants, both producing fruit despite years of neglect. A gooseberry bush so large it had become almost tree-like. And herbs, so many herbs. Lavender had spread everywhere, turning whole sections of the garden purple. Rosemary bushes as tall as my waist, their scent released with every brush of my legs against them. In the center of the garden stood the remains of a greenhouse. Most of the glass was gone, shattered by falling branches or winter storms, but the iron frame was still standing, elegant and geometric against the wild growth around it. Vines had claimed it completely, wrapping around every strut and beam, turning it into a living structure, green and growing. I stepped inside what had been the greenhouse. The floor was earth now, the original stone or tile long since buried. But things still grew here, sheltered by the partial roof of leaves above. I saw tomatoes again, and what might have been cucumber plants, and in one corner, improbably, a lemon tree in a huge clay pot, somehow still alive. It had 3 lemons on it, small and green, but definitely lemons. How was this possible? How had all of this survived with no one to tend it? I suppose that was the nature of gardens. Once established, really established, some of them could keep going on their own for a while. The perennials coming back year after year, the self-seeding annuals, the fruit bushes spreading. It was like the garden had gone feral, had returned to some wild version of itself. I continued exploring, finding more evidence of careful planning now overtaken by chaos. A section of what must have been cutting flowers, dahlias and gladiolus and delphiniums, all mixed together now, blooming according to their own schedule. A hedge that had once been neatly trimmed, now 15 feet tall and as wide as a small house. An ornamental pond, lined with stone, now half filled with mud and cattails, but still holding water. At the far end of the garden, I found what I'd been half expecting, another building. Smaller than the ruin by the pool, this one was in better condition. The roof was partially intact, and 3 of the 4 walls were still standing. It looked like it had been a potting shed or garden house. I approached cautiously. The door was gone, just an open rectangle leading into darkness. I stood in the doorway, letting my eyes adjust. Inside, I could make out shelves along one wall, most of them collapsed now, clay pots in various sizes, some broken, some intact, scattered across the floor. Rusted tools leaning in a corner, a spade, a hoe, what looked like a scythe. A wooden workbench along another wall, its surface warped and weathered, but still solid. And on that workbench, impossibly, a journal. My breath caught. I stepped inside carefully, avoiding the broken pots, and reached for it. The cover was leather, stained and water-damaged, but mostly intact. I opened it gently, afraid it might disintegrate in my hands.
The pages were brittle, and many were stuck together or too damaged to read. But some were still legible. I saw dates: 1949, 1950, 1951. Notes about plantings. Put in the roses along the south wall. Mary says they remind her of her mother's garden. The apple trees are doing well. We'll have fruit this year, I think. Repaired the greenhouse glass after the storm. Lucky it wasn't worse. Mary. Someone named Mary had lived here, had loved roses. Someone had planted those apple trees, had tended this garden, and written these careful notes about their progress. I turned the pages slowly, reading fragments of a life. Mary's birthday. Picked flowers for the house. Hard frost last night. Lost the tender plants. The lemons are flowering. Mary is delighted. The last entry was dated September 1952. The time has come. We can't stay any longer. Mary is heartbroken, but there's no choice. I hope whoever comes after us will love this place as we have. That was it. No explanation of why they left. No details about what happened. Just that simple, heartbreaking statement. They'd left in September 1952, and apparently no one had ever come after them. The garden, the buildings, the whole estate, all abandoned and slowly reclaimed by the forest. I stood there holding the journal, feeling like I'd been entrusted with something precious. These weren't just random ruins. This was Mary's garden. This was where she'd celebrated birthdays and mourned lost plants and delighted in flowering lemons. This was where someone had loved deeply and lost completely. I carefully placed the journal back on the workbench, not wanting to damage it further by carrying it out. It belonged here, in this place it documented. But I made a mental note of some of the entries, committing them to memory. Outside, the afternoon sun was slanting through the trees, casting long shadows across the wild garden. I walked back through it slowly, seeing it differently now. Not just a forgotten place, but Mary's place. The roses she'd planted because they reminded her of her mother's garden. The lemon tree that had delighted her. All of it still here, still growing, still beautiful, even in its abandonment. I found myself hoping that Mary, wherever she'd gone, had found another garden to love. But somehow, I doubted it. Places like this didn't come along twice in a lifetime. As I made my way back toward the gate, I noticed something carved into the stone archway, high up where I'd missed it before. I stood on my toes to see it better. 2 sets of initials in a heart. J.H. and M.H. 1947. J.H. and M.H. 1947. 2 years before the journal started. This must have been when they first came here, when they first started building their dream. 8 years they'd had. Just 8 years in this beautiful, hidden place before something forced them to leave. I touched the stone gently, then walked back through the gate and started up the path toward home. Behind me, Mary's garden continued its slow, patient return to wildness, keeping its secrets, growing its roses, waiting for no one.
I couldn't stop thinking about Mary and J.H. That night, lying in bed, I kept seeing the garden, the journal, those initials carved in stone. Who were they? What had forced them to leave? And most puzzling, why had no one else ever taken over the property? The next morning, instead of returning to the path, I drove to the village I'd seen from the hilltop. It had taken me a while to locate it on a map, the village of Ashford, population maybe 300, tucked into a valley about 5 miles from where I lived. I'd driven past the turnoff dozens of times without ever thinking to explore it. The village was exactly what you'd expect. A single main street with a post office, a pub, a small grocery, and a church with a cemetery beside it. Stone cottages lined the road, most of them looking like they'd been there for centuries. I parked near the pub and sat for a moment, trying to decide my approach. The pub was the obvious choice. Pubs were where you learned village history, where the old-timers gathered and talked. I pushed through the door just before noon and found myself in a low-ceilinged room with dark beams and a fireplace. 3 men sat at the bar, all of them past retirement age, all of them turning to look at me with undisguised curiosity. "Help ya?" The bartender was a woman in her 60s, her gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "Pint of whatever's local," I said, taking a seat at the bar, "and maybe some information if you don't mind." She pulled the pint and set it in front of me. "Information about what?" "The Ashford estate. I found a marker post in the woods dated 1952. I was curious about the history." The 3 men exchanged glances. The bartender's expression shifted, became more guarded. "That's old history. Why do you want to know?" "Just curious," I said, keeping my tone casual. "I like local history, old places. Thought maybe there was a story there." One of the men, the oldest of the 3, spoke up. His voice was rough, like he'd spent years shouting over machinery. "There's a story, all right, but it's not a happy one." "I'd still like to hear it," I said. He studied me for a long moment, then shrugged. "Suit yourself. The estate belonged to James and Mary Harper. He inherited it from his uncle in 1947, right after the war. Beautiful property. House, gardens, woodlands, the lot. They moved in, fixed it up, made it into something special." "What happened?" I asked. "Fire," he said simply. 1952, September. The house burned to the ground. Mary was inside." I felt my stomach drop. Mary, the woman who loved roses and delighted in lemon trees. "She died." He nodded. "James got her out, but she'd breathed in too much smoke. She died 3 days later in hospital. James couldn't bear to stay after that. Sold the property. Or tried to. But no one wanted it. Cursed, people said. Bad luck. So it just sat there, abandoned." "What happened to James?" I asked quietly. "Moved away. No one knows where. Some say he went abroad, Australia maybe. Never came back, that's for certain." The old man took a drink. "That was 73 years ago. The property's been sitting empty ever since. Legally, it belongs to someone, descendants probably, but they've never done anything with it. Just let it go back to nature." I sat there processing this, thinking about the journal entries I'd read. We can't stay any longer. Mary is heartbroken, but there's no choice. They hadn't left by choice. They never left at all. The journal had been written before the fire. James must have written that last entry after, trying to explain the unexplainable. "Where was the house?" I asked. "I've been walking the property. I found the gardens and a small building by a pool, but nothing that looked like a main house." The bartender answered this time. "Up on the eastern ridge. You wouldn't find much now. After the fire, what was left standing eventually collapsed. It's probably just foundation stones and rubble now, all covered over with growth." "The gardens were something special," another of the men said, speaking for the first time. He was younger than the other 2, maybe late 60s. "My grandmother worked there before the fire, said it was the most beautiful place she'd ever seen. Mrs. Harper, Mary, she had a real gift with plants. Everything she touched seemed to grow." "It's still growing," I said without thinking. All 4 of them stared at me. "You've been there," the bartender said. It wasn't a question. "I found a path," I admitted. "It led to the gardens. They're overgrown, but the roses are still there, the fruit trees, even a lemon tree in the old greenhouse." The youngest man shook his head slowly. "I'll be damned. That lemon tree is still alive. Mary babied that thing like it was her child. Brought it all the way from Italy, she did. James built that greenhouse specifically for it because it couldn't survive outside. "It's still alive," I confirmed. "Even has fruit on it." Something in the atmosphere of the pub shifted. The wariness was still there, but mixed now with something else. Wonder, maybe, or nostalgia. "Would you—" he hesitated. "Would you mind if I came with you sometime to see the gardens? My mother used to talk about them. She was friends with Mary. I'd like to see what's left." "Of course," I said. "I'd be happy to show you." We arranged to meet the following week. She introduced herself as Patricia and the men as Tom, Bill, and Dennis. Tom was the oldest, the one who'd told me the story. Dennis was the one whose grandmother had worked there. By the time I finished my pint, they'd told me a dozen more stories about the Harpers and the estate. James had been a writer, they said, modestly successful, enough to live on when combined with the income from the estate's small farm operations. Mary had been a teacher before they married, but she'd given it up to focus on the gardens. They'd been deeply in love, anyone could see it. The fire had destroyed James as surely as it had killed Mary. There was one more thing, Tom said as I was preparing to leave. The chapel. If you really want to understand the place, you should find the chapel. It's in the woods, north of where the house stood. Stone building, probably still intact since it's all stone. That's where they got married, James and Mary. Private ceremony, just the two of them and the vicar. "I'll look for it," I promised. I drove home slowly, my mind full of images. Mary in her garden, tending her roses. James writing in some sunny room of the house that no longer existed. The two of them walking together through their beautiful property, planning, dreaming, building a life, and then fire and loss and a grief so profound that James had abandoned everything and disappeared. That evening, I pulled out the local historical records online. I found brief mentions of the fire, newspaper articles from September 1952. They confirmed what Tom had told me. The fire had started in the early hours of the morning, cause unknown, possibly electrical. James had gotten Mary out, but not quickly enough. She died 3 days later in hospital. There was a photograph accompanying one article, grainy and poor quality. It showed a stone house, substantial and elegant, with extensive gardens visible in the foreground. And standing in front of it, a couple. The caption read, "James and Mary Harper at Ashford Estate, 1948. I studied the photograph. James was tall, dark-haired, serious-looking. Mary was smaller, with light hair and a bright smile. She was holding something. I zoomed in as much as the image quality would allow. Flowers. She was holding a bouquet of roses. I sat back, feeling a deep sadness wash over me. They'd had 5 years, just 5 years of happiness in their hidden paradise before it all ended. 5 years of gardens and writing and love and lemon trees and roses that reminded her of her mother. And then 73 years of silence and slow return to wilderness. I looked at the photograph again, at Mary's smile, and made a decision. Tomorrow, I'd go back and find that chapel, and then I'd start taking care of the garden again, the way Mary would have wanted. It was the least I could do.
The next morning, I returned to the estate with a rough map I'd sketched based on Tom's directions. North of where the house had stood, he'd said. The chapel was all stone, probably still intact. I just had to find the house ruins first. I took the now familiar route through the meadow, past the oak gateway, and up to the hilltop clearing. From there, I continued down to Mary's garden, but instead of stopping, I kept going, following the path as it curved eastward. The terrain rose steadily, and after about 15 minutes of climbing, I found myself on a broad ridge. The forest opened up here, the trees more spaced out, and I could see evidence of old landscaping. Deliberately planted oaks forming rough lines, the remains of what might have been a carriageway. And then I saw it. Not much, just as the bartender had said. Foundation stones breaking through the undergrowth, sections of wall no higher than my ankle, fragments of chimney brick scattered everywhere. But the outline was clear once I knew what to look for. The house had been substantial, maybe 40 feet across, with multiple rooms. I walked through what had been the rooms, trying to imagine them as they'd been. This might have been the room where James wrote his books. That corner could have been where Mary kept her plants during winter. Here was where the fireplace had stood, a large one, judging by the scattered stones. I knelt and touched them, blackened still after 73 years. The fire had been thorough. There was almost nothing left that was recognizable as having been part of a home. Just stones and ash and the weight of tragedy hanging in the air. I didn't linger. Following Tom's directions, I headed north from the ruins. The forest grew denser again, mostly pine and fir on this slope, their fallen needles creating a thick, soft carpet. The light took on a greenish quality, filtered through layers of evergreen branches. I walked for maybe 20 minutes, starting to wonder if I'd gotten the directions wrong, when I saw a break in the trees ahead. A small clearing, and in its center, exactly as Tom had described, a stone chapel. It was tiny, couldn't have held more than a dozen people, but perfectly proportioned. Stone walls, steep slate roof still intact, a simple wooden door and one narrow window with leaded glass that had somehow survived. The stone was covered in moss and lichen, and ivy had claimed one entire wall, but the structure itself looked sound. I walked in slowly, feeling like I was intruding on something sacred. The door had no lock, just an old iron latch. I lifted it and pushed gently. The hinges protested, but the door opened. Inside was a single room, maybe 12 feet by 15. Simple wooden pews, enough seating for 8 or 9 people. A stone altar at the far end with a plain wooden cross mounted on the wall above it. The leaded window cast patterns of colored light across the floor. Someone had included stained glass panels, just a few, showing simple designs of flowers and birds. The air inside was cool and still, carrying that particular smell of old stone and wood. Dust motes drifted in the colored light from the window. It was the most peaceful place I'd ever been. I sat down in one of the pews, the wood creaking under my weight. From where I sat, I could see the altar, the cross, the window. I could imagine James and Mary standing there, making their vows to each other, beginning their life together. Just the two of them and the vicar, Tom had said. An intimate ceremony in this hidden chapel, surrounded by forest. I noticed something carved in the pew in front of me. Leaning forward, I could just make it out in the dim light. J&M, July 1947. They'd carved their initials here, on their wedding day. My throat tightened. Looking around more carefully, I saw other carvings in the old wood, dates going back over a century, other initials, other couples who'd been married here. This chapel had seen generations of private ceremonies, quiet declarations of love, made away from crowds and noise.
I stood and walked to the altar. It was bare, except for a thick layer of dust. Behind it, in the corner, I noticed something. A small wooden box, carved with simple designs. I picked it up carefully and opened it. Inside were candles, old but still usable. Matches in a tin, surprisingly dry. And at the bottom, a book. Not a Bible, as I'd expected, but a guest book of sorts. A record of the marriages performed here. I carried it to the window, where the light was better, and opened it. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded in places, but readable. I saw entries going back to 1843. Names, dates, witnesses. A history of love written in careful handwriting by successive vicars. I paged forward carefully until I found it. James Michael Harper and Mary Elizabeth Thornton, July 12, 1947. Witnessed by Reverend Thomas Ashworth and Mrs. Helen Ashworth. I stood there holding the book, looking at their names, thinking about everything that had come after. 5 years of happiness, then fire, loss, abandonment. 73 years of silence. On impulse, I took one of the candles from the box and lit it, setting it on the altar. I didn't know why exactly. I wasn't religious, hadn't been in years, but it felt right somehow. A small light for Mary and James, an acknowledgement of what they had and what they'd lost. I sat back down in the pew and watched the candle burn, its small flame steady in the still air. Outside, I could hear birds and wind moving through the pines. Inside was just silence and shadows, and that one small point of light. I'm not sure how long I sat there. Long enough for the candle to burn down an inch, long enough for my mind to quiet completely, for the constant worry and planning that usually filled my thoughts to fall away. There was something about this place that demanded stillness, that made busyness seem irrelevant. Eventually, I stood, replaced the marriage book in its box, and left the candle burning on the altar. I'd come back, I decided. I'd bring Patricia and the others from the village. Let them see the gardens, the chapel, the places where Mary and James had been happy. As I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, I felt like I'd been given something. Not just the discovery of a beautiful place, but a reminder that love leaves traces. That even when everything else is lost, even when fire destroys and time buries, something remains. Initials carved in stone. Gardens that keep growing. A chapel in the forest holding its secrets. I walked back through the pines, the late afternoon light slanting through the branches, and thought about Mary's roses still blooming wild in her garden. about her lemon tree still bearing fruit, about these small acts of persistence, these refusals to be completely forgotten. When I reached the meadow again, the late sun had turned everything golden. I stopped and looked around, seeing it all differently now. Not just a beautiful, forgotten place, but a living memorial to people who'd loved deeply and lost everything. I would take care of it, I decided. I would tend Mary's garden, visit the chapel, walk these paths. Not to bring it back to what it was, that was impossible, but to honor what it had been, to make sure someone remembered. As I walked home through the lengthening shadows, I felt more at peace than I had in years, like I'd finally found something worth doing, something that mattered.
I came back the next day with tools. Pruning shears, work gloves, a small folding saw I'd found in my garage. I wasn't entirely sure what I was doing, but I knew I had to start somewhere. Mary's garden deserved better than wild neglect. The morning was cool and clear as I made my way through the meadow. Dew still clung to everything, and my shoes were soaked by the time I reached the garden gate. I stood there for a moment, looking at the controlled chaos inside, trying to decide where to begin. The roses seemed like the obvious choice. They were everywhere, but many of them had grown so large and tangled that they'd collapsed under their own weight. I started with one near the entrance, a massive bush that had fallen across the path, blocking it completely. I'd never pruned roses before, but I remembered my mother doing it when I was young. "You cut back to healthy wood," she'd said. "Look for the outward-facing bud. Make clean cuts." I started carefully, removing dead wood first, then thinning out the crowded center of the bush to let in light and air. The work was harder than I had expected. The thorns caught on my clothes and tore at my hands, even through the gloves. The branches were thick and tough, requiring all my strength to cut through. But there was something deeply satisfying about it. The physical effort, the immediate visible results, the sense of bringing order back to something beautiful. After 2 hours, I'd cleared the path and pruned 3 of the rose bushes. They looked better already, more like deliberate plantings and less like wild thickets. I stepped back to admire my work and noticed something I'd missed before. Small metal stakes in the ground placed at intervals along the path. Most were rusted and bent, but I could still make out engraved names on some of them. Plant labels. Mary had labeled everything. I knelt beside the nearest one and used my thumb to rub away 70 years of rust and dirt. Rosa Zephyrine Druin, 1948. The rose I'd just been pruning. I moved to the next bush. Rosa Madame Alfred Carrière, 1949. And the next. Rosa Constance Spry, 1950. Each one had been chosen, planted, named, and loved. I felt the weight of responsibility settled more heavily on my shoulders. This wasn't just any garden, it was Mary's carefully curated collection, every plant selected for a reason. I worked through the afternoon, moving from the roses to the herb garden. The lavender didn't need much, just deadheading and removing some of the woody growth. The rosemary was another story. Some bushes had grown so large they died out in the center, leaving hollow circles of green around dead wood. I pruned what I could salvage and marked the ones that would need to be replaced. As I worked, I thought about Mary doing these same tasks, standing in these same spots, pruning these same plants when they were younger, smaller. Had she worked alone, or had James helped her? Had they talked while they worked, or enjoyed companionable silence? The sun was starting to lower when I heard footsteps on the path. I turned, startled. I'd never encountered another person here, and saw Patricia from the pub picking her way carefully through the gate. "Hope you don't mind," she said. "Tom told me you'd probably be here. I couldn't wait until next week. I had to see it." "Of course," I said, brushing dirt from my hands. "I'm glad you came." She walked slowly into the garden, her eyes moving over everything, the roses, the fruit trees, the wild profusion of herbs and flowers. Her hand went to her mouth. "Oh," she said softly, "oh, it's still here. It's all still here." "Did you know Mary?" I asked. "No, I was born in 55, but my mother talked about this place constantly. She and Mary were close friends. After the fire, after Mary died, my mother never really got over it. She used to bring me to the edge of the estate when I was little, but she never had the heart to walk in. Said it hurt too much." Patricia moved deeper into the garden, stopping at different plants, touching leaves gently. "Mom said Mary knew every plant by name, could tell you exactly when she had planted it, where the cuttings had come from, what its particular needs were. She was like a mother to them." We walked together through the garden, and Patricia shared stories her mother had told her. How Mary had ordered the lemon tree from a specialist in Cornwall, had it shipped by train in the winter, kept it alive through frost that first year. How she'd traded cuttings with other gardeners, building a network of plant lovers across 3 counties. How James had built the greenhouse himself, learning as he went, because Mary dreamed of growing things that shouldn't survive in English winters. "What did he write?" I asked. "Tom said James was a writer, but not what he wrote. Historical novels mostly, nothing famous, but they sold well enough. He was working on something about the English Civil War when the fire happened. Never finished it, obviously. Mom said the manuscript was lost in the fire." We reached the greenhouse and stood looking at the lemon tree. 3 small green fruits hung among the glossy leaves. "I can't believe it's still alive," she whispered, "after all these years." It was her favorite, wasn't it? Her pride and joy. She called it her Italian daughter. Patricia laughed softly, tears in her eyes. "Mom said Mary talked to it, sung to it sometimes when she thought no one was listening." We stood there in silence for a while, looking at the tree, thinking our own thoughts about the woman who loved it. "Thank you," Patricia said finally, "for finding this place, for taking care of it. Mom would have been so happy to know someone was looking after Mary's garden again." "I'm just beginning," I said. "There's so much to do. I barely know where to start." "I can help," she said immediately. "I'm not as good a gardener as Mary was, but Mom taught me, and I know others in the village who'd want to help too. Dennis, whose grandmother worked here, he's got her old photographs of the garden, and Bill used to do landscaping before he retired.
We could do this properly, as a community, the way it should have been all along. I felt something loosen in my chest. I'd been thinking of this as my solitary project, my personal responsibility. But Patricia was right. This place belonged to more people than just me. It belonged to everyone who remembered Mary and James, everyone who'd been touched by their story that ended in tragedy, but somehow kept going, kept growing like Mary's roses, kept bearing fruit like her lemon tree, kept mattering even after 73 years of silence.
The following Saturday, they came. Not just Patricia and the 3 men from the pub, but others. 9 people in total, ranging in age from their 30s to their 80s. They arrived mid-morning carrying tools and supplies, their voices bright with excitement as they made their way up the path. I met them at the meadow where I'd been waiting nervously. I'd spent the week worrying that this was a mistake, that bringing so many people would somehow violate the peace of the place. But watching them emerge from the hedgerow, seeing their faces as they caught their first glimpse of the wildflower meadow, I knew I'd been wrong to worry. "My God," said an elderly woman I didn't recognize. "I never thought I'd see this again." Patricia introduced everyone. The woman was Ellen, who'd worked as a cook at the estate during the last year before the fire. There was Dennis, whose grandmother had been the gardener, Bill, the retired landscaper, Tom from the pub, and 5 others, all with their own connections to the place. Parents who'd known Mary and James, grandparents who'd worked the estate, or simply people who'd grown up hearing the stories and wanted to help. We walked together to the garden. I'd worried about how they'd react to its wild state, but instead there was wonder. Ellen kept stopping to touch things, a rose bush, a lavender plant, the stone edge of a raised bed, as if confirming they were real. Dennis pulled out an old photograph his grandmother had kept, and we spent 20 minutes trying to match the current garden to the black and white image from 1950. "The structure is all still here," Bill said, walking the paths with a professional eye. "The bones are good. We just need to clear back the excess growth, repair the paths, get these beds defined again. It's not as overwhelming as it looks." We divided into teams. Bill and Dennis took charge of clearing the main paths, cutting back years of overgrowth. Patricia and Ellen focused on the herb garden, identifying plants and deciding what could stay and what needed removing. Tom and 2 others tackled the perimeter wall, repairing sections that had collapsed. The rest of us worked on the roses, following the pattern I'd started the week before. As we worked, stories emerged. Ellen remembered Mary's voice, how she'd sing while she gardened, old folk songs and hymns. Dennis's grandmother had taught Mary grafting techniques, and they'd spent whole afternoons experimenting with different rose varieties. Tom's father had helped James build the greenhouse, carrying glass panes up from the village on a borrowed cart. "They were so in love," Ellen said at one point, pausing in her work. "It was beautiful to watch, but also a bit intimidating, like they existed in their own world and the rest of us were just visitors to it." "My grandmother said the same thing," Dennis added. "Said she'd never seen 2 people more perfectly matched. When Mary died, it was like watching half of a whole person trying to function. James was never the same after." We worked through the day, breaking for lunch in the shade of the greenhouse. Patricia had brought sandwiches, and Tom had contributed bottles of cider from the pub. We sat in a rough circle, eating and talking, and I felt something shift in the dynamics of the group.
We'd started as strangers working on a project. Now we were something more, a community united by shared purpose and shared history. After lunch, I took Ellen and Patricia to the chapel. I told Patricia about it during the week, but she hadn't yet seen it. Ellen had never been. It had been too far from the main house for her daily duties to bring her there. The walk through the pines was quiet, just the sound of our footsteps on the needle-covered ground. When we emerged into the clearing and Ellen saw the chapel, she simply stopped walking. "Mary used to come here," she said finally. "After the fire started, when James carried her out, she kept saying, 'The chapel, take me to the chapel.' We thought she was delirious, but maybe she meant she wanted to die here, in the place where they'd been married." We stood in silence for a moment, processing this. Then Patricia gently pushed open the door, and we went inside. The candle I'd lit weeks ago had long since burned out. But someone, I didn't know who, had lit a new one. It burned steadily on the altar, casting shadows in the dim interior. Ellen sat in a pew and closed her eyes. Patricia and I gave her space, standing near the door. After several minutes, Ellen opened her eyes and looked around. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for bringing me here, for letting me see this. I've carried the memory of that night for 73 years. The smoke, Mary's coughing, her being taken away in the ambulance. It's been hard to remember the good times before, but sitting here in this peaceful place, I can remember her happy again. I can see her as she was before, not just as she was at the end." We walked back slowly, Ellen between us, her arms linked through ours. When we reached the garden again, the transformation was remarkable. The paths were clear, the beds defined, the roses tamed back to manageable sizes. It still looked wild in places, but now it was beautiful wildness, intentional rather than neglected. Bill had made a list of materials we'd need: stones for path repair, tools for more serious pruning, stakes and ties for plants that needed support. He said he could get most of this donated. He knows people. They'll help once they hear what we're doing. We worked until the light began to fade, then gathered at the gate for a final look at what we'd accomplished. One day's work had made a visible difference. More importantly, it had established something: a commitment, a pattern, a promise. "Same time next week?" Patricia asked, and everyone nodded. As the group dispersed, heading back down the path towards their cars, Dennis hung back. He pulled out the photograph his grandmother had kept and handed it to me. "I want you to have this," he said. "Grandma would have liked knowing someone was taking care of this place again. Use it as a guide. Try to bring it back to how it was in the picture." I looked at the photograph. Mary standing in the garden, surrounded by roses in full bloom, her face bright with pride. Behind her, just visible, was James, holding a camera, capturing her wife in her element. "I'll do my best," I said. Dennis nodded and headed down the path. I stood at the gate, watching the last of the light fade from the sky, holding the photograph carefully. The garden around me was quiet now, settling into evening. A blackbird was singing its last song of the day from somewhere in the apple trees. The roses released their perfume more strongly as the air cooled. I thought about community, about how grief shared becomes lighter, and how work shared becomes joy. about how a place could hold memory, and memory could bring people together across generations. About Mary and James building their paradise and losing it, but somehow, through the years and the wilderness and the forgetting, that paradise persisting. I locked the gate. We'd installed a simple latch to keep out animals, and started home. Behind me, Mary's garden rested under the emerging stars, waiting for next Saturday, for the work to continue, for the slow, patient process of restoration. As I walked through the meadow, I realized I felt different than I had a month ago. Lighter somehow, more connected, like I'd found not just a forgotten place, but a forgotten part of myself, the part that knew how to care about something beyond my own immediate concerns, how to be part of something larger than myself. The meadow grass whispered in the evening breeze. Somewhere an owl called. The path ahead was clear in the moonlight. And behind me, 9 other people were carrying the same satisfaction I felt, the same sense of purpose renewed, the same connection to a story that seemed ended but was in fact continuing, growing like Mary's roses, persisting. The weeks turned into months, and summer gave way to autumn. The garden transformed with the seasons, revealing new aspects of itself that we hadn't seen before. The roses finished their main bloom and settled into producing scattered late flowers. The fruit trees dropped their leaves, exposing their architectural forms. And everywhere, autumn colors emerged. The fiery red of Japanese maples Mary had planted, the golden yellow of birch trees, the deep burgundy of wild cherry. Our Saturday gatherings had become routine now. Sometimes 8 people showed up, sometimes 12. We'd developed an easy rhythm, arriving mid-morning, working until lunch, then continuing until the light began to fade. The garden was no longer wild and chaotic. It was beginning to look intentional again, cared for, loved. The paths were all clear and repaired now, the stones reset where they'd shifted. The raised beds had been weeded and mulched. The roses were properly pruned and staked. Bill had rebuilt sections of the perimeter wall that had collapsed. Patricia had taken charge of the herb garden, bringing cuttings from her own plants to fill gaps where things had died. One Saturday in late October, Dennis arrived carrying a wooden box. "Found this in my grandmother's attic," he said, setting it down carefully. "Her garden records from when she worked here." We gathered around as he opened it. Inside were notebooks, seed packets, garden plans drawn on yellowing paper, and dozens of photographs. We spent the next hour poring over them, trying to match what we saw in the pictures to what surrounded us now. "Look at this," Patricia said, holding up a garden plan dated 1951. "This shows the whole layout. Mary had sections for different purposes, cutting flowers here, vegetables there, medicinal herbs in this corner. And look, she'd labeled each rose by name and date planted." We compared the plan to our current garden. Most of Mary's organizational system was still intact, just obscured by years of growth. With this map, we could restore not just the physical garden, but her vision for it. "There's more," Dennis said, pulling out a leather-bound book. "My grandmother's diary from 1950 to 1952. She wrote about working here, about Mary, about the garden. I thought you might want to read it." He handed it to me, and I opened it carefully. The first entry was from March 1950. "Started work at Ashford Estate today. Mrs. Harper is the kindest employer I've ever had. She works alongside us in the garden, never asks anything of us she wouldn't do herself. Her knowledge of plants is extraordinary. I read more entries aloud to the group. Stories of Mary teaching Dennis's grandmother about companion planting and moon cycles, of James bringing tea to everyone working in the garden on hot afternoons, of harvest celebrations and winter planning sessions. And then, heartbreakingly, the final entries from September 1952 describing the fire and its aftermath. She stopped writing after Mary died. Never could bring herself to work in another garden, said it wouldn't feel right. We sat in silence for a while, each of us thinking about continuity and loss. Then Ellen spoke up. Mary would love what you're all doing here. She always said gardens were meant to be shared, not hoarded. She'd be happy knowing people are enjoying this place again. That afternoon, using the garden plan and photographs as guides, we began a more systematic restoration. We identified which roses were which, matching them to Mary's careful labels. We discovered a whole section of the garden we'd overlooked, a small orchard beyond the greenhouse, with apple, pear, and plum trees still producing fruit. How did we miss this? Bill wondered, standing among the fruit trees. We were focused on what was obvious, Patricia said. Mary designed this place with layers. You had to really explore to find everything. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself alone in the greenhouse, checking on the lemon tree. It had grown since I'd first seen it, putting on new growth and more fruits. 7 lemons now hung among the glossy leaves. I gently touched one, thinking about Mary's Italian daughter, about how she'd babied this plant through harsh English winters, how she'd sung to it. It's thriving, Patricia said from behind me. I hadn't heard her approach. You've been taking good care of it. We all have, I said. She stood beside me looking at the tree. I visited my mother this week, told her about what we're doing here. She cried, happy tears, said she'd thought Mary's garden was lost forever. We could bring her here, I suggested, if she's well enough to make the walk. I'd like that, Patricia said. She's 87 now, but still strong. I think she'd manage it, especially if we took it slow. We walked back outside where the others were finishing up for the day. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the garden. Everything looked golden in that light, the stone walls, the remaining leaves on the trees, even the bare earth of the freshly weeded beds. Tom was photographing everything, documenting our progress. He'd said weeks ago, we should make a record, show how the garden changes as we bring it back. He'd been taking pictures every week, creating a visual timeline of restoration. As we prepared to leave, Ellen lingered by the gate. I haven't told you this, but coming here every week has changed something for me. I'm 91 years old. I've spent 73 years carrying guilt about that night, wondering if there was something I could have done differently, some way I could have prevented the fire or gotten Mary out faster. She paused, gathering her thoughts. But being here, seeing the garden alive again, seeing all of you working to preserve what Mary created, it's given me peace. It's shown me that what matters isn't how things end, but what they were at their best. And at their best, this place was extraordinary. We stood together as the sun set behind the trees, 9 people of different ages and backgrounds united by a garden and a story. The evening air was cool and smelled of earth and fallen leaves. Somewhere in the forest, an owl was beginning its evening hunt. The first stars were appearing overhead. "Same time next week?" Patricia asked, as she always did. And we all nodded, as we always did, knowing we'd return because this place had become part of us now, woven into the fabric of our weeks, giving us purpose and connection and a link to something larger than ourselves. I walked home through the autumn twilight, thinking about gardens and memory, about how the work of preservation is also the work of healing, about bringing life back to abandoned places can bring something back to life in ourselves, too. The meadow grass had turned golden with the season, and it glowed in the last light of the day. I stopped to look back at the path I'd walked so many times now, the path that had led me to Mary's garden and the chapel, and this community of people who'd become friends. In my pocket was the garden plan Dennis had given me, carefully folded. At home, I'd study it, learn Mary's system, understand her vision more completely, and next week we'd continue the work, guided by her original design, bringing her dream back to life, one plant, one path, one stone at a time. The stars were bright now, scattered across the darkening sky. I could see the lights of the village in the distance, warm and welcoming. And behind me, the garden settled into night, the plants resting, gathering strength for tomorrow's growth. Everything continuing, everything persisting, everything growing toward light, just as Mary would have wanted, just as it should be.
November arrived with frost and shorter days. Our Saturday gatherings became fewer as the weather turned cold and the garden entered dormancy. But I still came, sometimes alone, sometimes with one or two others, doing the quiet work of winter, mulching beds, protecting tender plants, and repairing tools in the old potting shed. The garden looked different now, stripped down to its essential structure. Without the distraction of flowers and full foliage, I could see the elegance of Mary's design more clearly. The way paths curved to create sight lines, how she'd grouped plants by height and texture, the careful balance between cultivated and wild spaces. One cold Saturday in mid-November, Patricia arrived with her mother. I'd been working in the greenhouse when I heard voices on the path and came out to find them making their slow way through the gate. Patricia's mother, Margaret, leaned heavily on a walking stick, but her eyes were bright and alert. "Mrs. Clark," I said, going to help, "I'm so glad you could come." "Call me Margaret," she said, her voice still strong despite her age. "And I wouldn't have missed this for anything. I've waited 73 years to see this place again." We walked slowly through the garden, Margaret stopping frequently to look at things, to touch them, to remember. At the rose beds, she knelt down with difficulty, running her fingers over the pruned canes. "These are the ones Mary planted in '48, she said. "I helped her. We worked for 3 days straight, getting them all in before a cold snap came." "Do you remember her well?" I asked. "Like it was yesterday," Margaret said. "She was my best friend. We were the same age, both newly married, both trying to figure out how to be adults. But she was wiser somehow, calmer. She had this way of being completely present with whatever she was doing. When she gardened, nothing else existed. When she listened to you talk, you felt like you were the only person in the world." Patricia helped her mother to a bench Bill had built near the greenhouse. We sat together, looking out over the winter garden.
"Tell me about the fire," I said gently, "if you want to, if it's not too difficult." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "I was at home when it happened. My husband woke me. He'd seen the glow in the sky. By the time we got here, the house was already gone. Just flames everywhere, so hot you couldn't get close. James was sitting on the ground 50 yards away, holding Mary. She was unconscious. The smoke, you see, her lungs." She paused, gathering herself. "They took her to hospital. James went with her. Those 3 days she lingered, they were the worst of my life. Watching James sit by her bed, holding her hand, talking to her even though she never woke up. And then she was gone, and James was just empty, hollow, like someone had reached inside him and scooped out everything that made him who he was." "What happened to him after?" I asked it. "He came back here once, about a week after the funeral. I found him in the garden, just standing among the roses, crying. He said he couldn't stay, couldn't bear to be here without her. He gave me a box of Mary's things, her garden journals, some photographs, personal items. Said he wanted me to have them since Mary would have wanted that. Then he left. I never saw him again." "Do you still have the box?" Patricia asked quietly.
Margaret nodded. "It's in my attic. I couldn't bring myself to look through it properly. Too painful. But I never got rid of it either. I always thought, I don't know what I thought, that someday it would matter to someone." "It matters now," I said. "Would you let us see it?" That's why I'd asked Patricia to bring me today. I wanted to see if you were serious about this, about caring for Mary's garden. And I can see you are. The box is yours if you want it. Maybe it's time Mary's story was properly told." We sat in silence for a while, each of us thinking our own thoughts. A robin landed nearby, pecking at the mulch, searching for insects. The sky was gray with low clouds, and the air smelled of coming snow. "Can I show you something?" I asked Margaret. I helped her up, and we walked slowly to the greenhouse. Inside, the lemon tree stood in its corner, green and thriving despite the cold outside. 7 lemons hung among the leaves, grown large now, turning from green to yellow. Margaret stopped walking. Her hand went to her mouth. "The Italian daughter," she whispered. "It's still alive. After all this time, it's still alive." "Mary's favorite," I said. "More than favorite," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "She loved that tree like it was her child. She and James couldn't have children. Something medical, I never knew the details. The lemon tree became, I don't know, a symbol of something for her. Life continuing, growth, hope." She approached the tree slowly and touched one of the lemons with incredible gentleness. "She used to talk to it, did you know that? She'd come out here every morning
and tell it about her dreams, her worries, her hopes for the garden. James used to tease her about it gently, but you could tell he found it endearing. Patricia put her arm around her mother. It survived because of her care. Even after she was gone, the foundation she gave it was strong enough to keep it going. Like the garden, Margaret said. Like everything she touched, she built things to last, to persist even without her. We stayed in the greenhouse for a long time, Margaret telling us stories I hadn't heard before. How Mary had experimented with grafting different citrus varieties onto the lemon tree. How she'd kept detailed records of every fruit it produced. How she'd shared lemons with everyone in the village, bringing them as gifts because they were so exotic, so impossible, so full of Mediterranean sunshine in the gray English winter.
When we finally left the greenhouse, snow had begun to fall. Light, scattered flakes that caught in the branches and dusted the paths. The garden looked magical under its white covering, transformed into something from a fairy tale. Mary loved the first snow, Margaret said. It said it made the garden look like it was resting under a blanket, gathering strength for spring. We walked Margaret back to the gate slowly, Patricia supporting her on one side and me on the other. At the entrance, she turned back for one last look. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for bringing her garden back. Thank you for caring about this. You've given me something I didn't know I needed, the knowledge that what Mary built matters, that her life meant something beyond the tragedy of her death. We're the ones who should thank you," I said, "for sharing your memories, for trusting us with Mary's story." Patricia drove her mother home, and I stayed in the garden watching the snow fall. It was peaceful here in winter, quiet, in a way that felt complete rather than empty. The bare branches created intricate patterns against the gray sky. The stone walls wore their white caps with dignity. Everything was waiting, patient, knowing that spring would come. I walked to the chapel before leaving, wanting to see it in the snow. The path through the pines was hushed, the needles catching and holding the flakes. When I reached the clearing, I found the chapel looked like something from a medieval manuscript. Stone walls dark against white ground, smoke-colored roof tiles disappearing into falling snow. I went inside. Someone had lit candles again, probably Patricia or Tom during the week. They burned steadily in the dim interior, their light warm and welcoming. I sat in the back pew, the same one where James and Mary's initials are carved, and let the peace of the place settle over me. I thought about Margaret's story, about James holding Mary as she died, about him coming back to the garden one last time before disappearing. I thought about 70 decades of silence and abandonment, and then this, people returning, caring, remembering, not trying to bring back what was lost, but honoring it, letting it inform the present. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, the candles burned, and somewhere in the greenhouse, Mary's lemon tree stood in its corner, still growing, still bearing fruit,
still persisting against all odds. I stayed until the candles were halfway burned, then closed the chapel door gently behind me and walked home through the snow-covered forest, my footprints the first marks on the white path. That night, Patricia called. "Mom wants you to come by tomorrow, to look at the box. She says it's time." "I'll be there," I promised. As I hung up, I looked out my window at the snow still falling, covering everything in white. Tomorrow would bring new discoveries, new pieces of Mary's story. But tonight I let myself simply rest in what I already knew, that some things persist despite time and tragedy, that love leaves marks that can't be erased, and that gardens, like stories, continue long after their creators are gone. Growing, persisting, mattering, always.
Margaret's house was a small cottage on the edge of the village, warm and cluttered with 70 years of accumulated life. She led me to her sitting room, where a wooden box sat on the table, about the size of a suitcase, bound with leather straps. "I haven't opened this properly since James gave it to me," she said. "Just couldn't bear it. But last night I took it down from the attic and I knew it was time." Patricia made tea while Margaret and I sat at the table. With slightly shaking hands, she unbuckled the straps and lifted the lid. Inside were layers of Mary's life, garden journals, dozens of them, covering every year from 1947 to 1952, photographs in careful albums, sketches and plans for the garden, pressed flowers between sheets of paper, letters tied with ribbon, and at the very bottom, a manuscript. "James's book," Margaret said softly. "The one he was writing when the fire happened. I'd forgotten it was in here." I lifted it carefully. The pages were typed, over 300 of them, with handwritten notes in the margins. The title page read, "The Garden at Ashford, a Love Story by James Harper." "It wasn't about the Civil War," Margaret said. "It was about Mary, about the garden, about their life here. He'd been writing it as a surprise for her, planning to gin it to her on their 5th anniversary, but the fire was 2 weeks before that date." I opened to a random page and read, "Mary says every garden is a portrait of the gardener's soul. If that's true, then her soul is patient and generous and utterly beautiful. She plants roses that won't bloom for years, fruit trees that won't bear for a decade. She's building something that will outlast us both, and she does it with such joy, such absolute certainty that the work itself is worthwhile, regardless of whether we're here to see its completion." My throat tightened. Did he know? Before the fire, did he know what was coming? "No one could have known," Margaret said. "But reading it now, it's like he was somehow preparing her legacy, documenting everything about the garden, about her, about what they built together." We spent the next 2 hours going through the box. The garden journals were meticulous, every plant recorded, every change noted, successes and failures documented with equal care. The photographs showed the garden in all its glory, and Mary and James in countless moments of happiness. working together, laughing, covered in dirt, surrounded by flowers. The letters were the hardest to read. Correspondence between Mary and James during a brief separation early in their marriage when he'd gone to London for work. They revealed the depth of their love, the way they completed each other, how they'd found in this estate and each other a kind of paradise. "There's one more thing," Margaret said, pulling out an envelope from a side pocket of the box. "James gave me this separately, said to open it only if someone ever came asking about the estate, about Mary. He said I'd know when the time was right." She handed it to me. The envelope was sealed, addressed to whomever cares for the garden. I opened it carefully and pulled out 2 pages of handwritten text. The handwriting was shaky, emotional, but still legible. It was dated September 1952, written in the hospital while Mary lay dying. I read it aloud. "To whoever finds this, if anyone ever does, I want you to know what this place was, not what it became in fire and loss, but what it was in joy and creation. Mary and I found each other late in life, both of us past 30, both of us thinking we'd missed our chance at real happiness. When we inherited this estate, it was run down and neglected, but Mary saw what it could be. She saw possibility where I saw only work. She made the garden not just beautiful, but meaningful. Every plant she chose had a story. The roses reminded her of her mother's garden in Sussex. The lemon tree was from our honeymoon in Italy. The apple trees were varieties her grandfather had grown. She was weaving together all the good memories of her life into something new, something living. I was writing this book to try to capture what she created, but I know I'll fail. Words can't hold the reality of her, the way she hummed while she worked, the dirt under her nails, the absolute peace that came over her face when she stood in the garden at dawn. The doctors say she won't wake up. I have perhaps a day, maybe 2, to write this before she leaves me. And all I can think is that the garden will survive her. Those roses will bloom next spring. That lemon tree will bear fruit. The life she poured into this place will continue, even though she won't be here to see it. I can't stay here without her. I've already decided. But I desperately hope, that someone will find this place someday. Someone who will see what Mary built and understand its value. Someone who will care for it, not to preserve it in amber, but to let it grow and change as she would have wanted. If you're reading this, you're that person. Thank you. Thank you for finding us. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for understanding that some things, love, beauty, creation, persist beyond the people who made them. Take care of her garden. Let it teach you what it taught me, that patience is rewarded, that beauty matters, that love expressed through action echoes longer than any words. James Harper, September 15, 1952. I set the letter down, unable to speak. Margaret was crying quietly. Patricia had her hand over her mouth. "He knew," I said finally. "He knew someone would come eventually. He'd trusted it." "And you did," Margaret said. 73 years later, you found them. You honored his trust." We sat in silence for a while, processing everything. Then Margaret said, "The box is yours now, all of it. The journals, the photographs, the manuscript. Use them. Share Mary's story. Make sure people know what was here, what they built." I carefully placed everything back in the box and buckled the straps. As I prepared to leave, Margaret stopped me. "One more thing. James did leave information about where he went. Australia, like people guessed. Sydney, specifically. He lived there until 1989. Never remarried, never stopped writing, though he never published anything after Mary died. When he passed, he left instructions that his ashes be scattered in the garden at Ashford, but by then, no one knew where the estate was anymore. The solicitors couldn't locate it, so his ashes were scattered at sea instead." "How do you know all this?" I asked. "He wrote to me, once a year, every year, on Mary's birthday. Just a short letter telling me he was still alive, still remembering. The last letter came in 1989. After that, nothing. I wrote back, but the letters were returned. That's when I contacted his publisher and learned he'd died."
She handed me a stack of letters, all in the same handwriting as the one to the garden's future caretaker. "These are yours too. The whole story, complete." I drove home with the box on my passenger seat, feeling the weight of responsibility and honor. That night, I started reading the manuscript, James's love letter to Mary and the garden. It was beautiful, heartbreaking, and utterly true to what I'd come to know of them. The winter passed. I spent evenings reading through Mary's journals, understanding her philosophy of gardening, her relationship with plants, her dreams for what the estate could become. I read James's letters from Australia, tales of exile, of carrying grief across oceans, of never forgetting. And then, finally, spring arrived. The first Saturday in March, we gathered at the garden again, our full group plus new volunteers who'd heard about the project. The winter had been kind. Everything we'd planted and protected was waking up, putting out new growth. The roses were budding, their new leaves bright green against the gray branches. The fruit trees were covered in blossom, white clouds of apple flowers, pink clusters of cherry blooms. The herbs were sending up fresh shoots, and in the greenhouse, Mary's lemon tree had burst into flower, filling the space with perfume so intense it almost made you dizzy. "It's never bloomed this much before," I said to Patricia. "Look at it. It's covered." "She knows," she said simply. "Somehow it knows it's being cared for again." We worked all day, preparing beds for new plantings, guided by Mary's plans. Ellen brought seeds she'd saved from her own garden, descendants of plants Mary had given to people in the village decades ago. We were literally planting Mary's legacy back into her garden. At midday, I gathered everyone together. "I have something to share," I said, and I read them James's letter. When I finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the group. "He wanted the garden to continue," Tom said finally. "And here we are, making that happen. We're answering him across 73 years. "I have an idea," Patricia said. "What if we create a memorial? Something small, not to mark death, but to celebrate what they built. A plaque in the chapel, maybe, or a bench with their names." Everyone agreed. Bill offered to carve a bench. Dennis said he could design a small bronze plaque. We'd place them in the spring, a permanent acknowledgement of Mary and James and the garden they'd created. The day ended with all of us sitting in the meadow as the sun set, tired and satisfied and connected. The wildflowers were beginning to emerge, early primroses and wood anemones dotting the grass with color. Birds were singing their evening songs. The air smelled of earth and growth and possibility. "Same time next week?" Patricia asked. "Always," we answered. As everyone left, I stayed behind, wanting a few moments alone. I walked through the garden slowly, seeing it with new eyes after all I'd learned. Every plant was a choice Mary had made, every path a decision, every wall placed with intention. This wasn't just a garden. It was a work of art, a declaration of love, a legacy built to outlast its creator. I ended up in the chapel as the last light faded. Candles were burning as usual, their flames steady in the still air. I sat in the pew with Mary and James's initials carved in it and thought about persistence and memory, about how love echoes forward through time, about how gardens and stories both need tending or they disappear. But they hadn't disappeared. Against all odds, 73 years of abandonment, Mary's garden had survived, and now it would thrive again, not as a museum piece, but as a living, growing thing, just as she had wanted. I thought about James in Australia, writing his annual letters to Margaret, never forgetting, never stopping his vigil of memory. I thought about Margaret keeping the box safe for decades, waiting for the right person to give it to. I thought about Ellen carrying guilt for 70 years until the garden gave her peace. I thought about all of us, drawn to this place by something we couldn't quite name, finding in it a purpose and a community. The candles flickered slightly in a draft I couldn't feel. Outside, night had fallen completely, and the forest was alive with evening sounds, owls hunting, foxes calling, small creatures moving through the undergrowth. Spring was here, and with it the promise of growth, of flowers, of fruit, of all the abundance Mary had dreamed of. I closed my eyes and let the peace of the chapel wash over me. Somewhere in my mind, I could almost hear Mary humming as she worked, could almost see James watching her with complete devotion, could almost feel what this place had been when they were alive and happy and together. And then I realized it still was all those things, different now, changed, but essentially the same. A place of beauty and peace, a place where people came together, a place where love persisted. I opened my eyes and stood, ready to head home. Tomorrow, I'd start transcribing Mary's journals, preparing them to share. I'd work on editing James's manuscript, getting it ready for publication so their story could finally be told. But tonight, I just wanted to walk home through the spring darkness, carrying their legacy with me, knowing I'd found what I'd been searching for, without knowing I was searching. Purpose, connection, meaning, peace. All of it, here in Mary's garden, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be loved, waiting patient as plants for someone to care. And I had cared. We all had, and we would continue to care, week after week, season after season, year after year. Growing, persisting, mattering.